I decided to do my sweater quilt pattern as a video pattern instead of a written pattern that I then have as a PDF. This is basically what you will need. You will need a sewing machine and the knowledge of basic patchwork quilting. You will need scissors, a template equal to the size of the square you're going to choose. Now, I've been using a 4 3/4 inch template so that I end up with 4 1/2 inch squares, and I use a 1/4 inch seam allowance on each side of the square. You will need 5 medium size sweaters, and woman's medium, 5 of them. And you will need fabric for the backing. You can either use random cottons, flannels, scrap fabrics. Everything is going to be cut the same size. I happen to buy 3 yards of this fabric, and I'm using probably 2 1/2 yards as squares. Now, I didn't count it all out in yardage before I started this, so that's a rough estimate of what you would need. And it's a very simple pattern. And I'm assuming that you have basic sewing and basic quilting skills. You are going to sew strips that are 10 squares wide, and each section is going to be 3 rows. So you will have 30 squares of your backing fabric, your cotton or flannel or fleece, and 30 squares of your sweater fabric. And that is the sample that I've made. This piece here is 3 rows by 10 wide. Now, the reason I'm saying that is because out of that brown sweater that I made this sample with, I was able to get about 36 squares of that size template. And that means this gives you a design element that you can use to your advantage. If you make each section the 30 squares as I just said, one sweater will make a section if you use women's medium size sweaters or larger. Then what you can do, I have my other 4 sweaters here, and as you can see, 3 of them will end up being in brownish. This one's gray, this one's multicolor. Let's say I had 3 red sweaters, a blue and a white, or 5 green sweaters. You can use the fact that you have different sections in order to arrange the colors of the sweaters that you're using. So I will probably put the 3 browns to one end, then the gray, and the multicolor at the other end. And so the sweater side of the quilt will go from a darker brown to a gray to a multicolor. And if I decide to mix it up, I could put the multicolor in the middle. And so this is going to be kind of a rag quilt idea, but not really. Each section, you can do it 2 ways. You can either cut out all 5 sweaters, arrange the squares any way you want, and it will be 10 squares wide by 15 long. And that's going to give you, I'll figure that out in 1 second. I'm trying to think. That looks to be about 15 inches by 40. It's going to be more of a lap size quilt than it would be a twin size. So you can do it either way. You can either cut out all the squares from all the sweaters and all the backing fabric and sew it like a traditional quilt where you piece all of one side first, then you piece all of the other side. You won't need a batting, so you can do it that way, and then all of your squares will end up looking like this. Or you can do it by the section, which is what I'm going to do, and each sweater will make a section. I can work on them when I want to or when I can. I don't have to do it all at once. And if I only have 3 sweaters, I can wait until I get more sweaters, more knits. Each section, what I'm going to do is then put the sweater sides together, right sides together, and sew these pieces together and leave about 1/4 of an inch seam allowance sticking up like a rag quilt. And then I will take scissors and cut into that seam allowance, so each section will be joined together like a rag quilt. So my own quilt will end up with 5 sections that are made separately with traditional quilting and then sewn together as rag quilt sections. And then around the entire edge, because they are sweaters, and I could put a binding on it. You can put a binding on it if you want. What I'm going to do is, again, I'm going to straight stitch the edge all the way around the quilt, and then I'm going to cut into the seam allowances. So all of the edges and my 4 seams joining the sections are going to be rag quilt type seams. Everything else is going to be, let me just show you this. Once you get a section or your quilt completely pieced together, what I did with this was just quilt it along the seams. And that is more than enough to give the quilt both warmth and substance, and it holds it all together nicely. You could also additionally go diagonally if you wanted to, but if you do that, you're going to need a real heavy-duty machine because each of the corners of the squares are going to have very thick seam allowances. So this was the easiest way to quilt this section. And now I will make the next section, and as I said, sew it together as a rag quilt section until I get all 5 of them done and sewn together. And that is how I'm going to be making a sweater quilt.